In this episode, humans Fred and Min talk to other human Jamie Joyce, an executive and ontologist known for her work designing AI applications for civic tech. Together, they explore what happens when machines write better poetry than people, and why being limited might be what makes humans human.
Jamie, so cool to meet you digitally, virtually. But I'd love people to kind of get a taste of all the things you do. I mean, we're going to have an interesting dialogue today, but you come at this from a very interesting point of view.
Yeah, so what's really important for people to know is that I work in AI and technology. We use it every single day in my work. I founded an organization called the Society Library. And for many, many years, I mean, we do educational programs and we create educational products, but our premier tool and service is to create these very large libraries that model the arguments, claims, and evidence from different points of view on complex policy uh, issues. And so we used to do this by hand. We would actually hire librarians to meticulously go through everything from government documents to scholarly articles to books, textbooks, podcasts, YouTube videos, social media, you name it, and gather all the different points of view and arguments that people are making and then organize them in these databases that we visualize as libraries. And for the past couple of years, we've just been working on automating all of that with artificial intelligence. So I'm a big fan of AI. I'm a big fan of technology. I also worked in the archive space for a little bit and, pretty policy adjacent. But yeah, when I saw in one of my AI chats, because we have mapped debates about AI in our work, when I saw in one of these AI chats that someone posted a paper from Nature, and the name of the paper is called AI Generated Poetry is Indistinguishable from Human Written Poetry and is Rated More Favorably. I went on this little rant because I am also a poet. I used to have a little poet society. It was called the Sunburnt Poets Society. It was a slam poetry group. And I was more of like a secret poet in this group because my goal was really to help professionalize these amazing slam poets who I discovered in like the most divey of dive bars. And they were actually incredibly good and they would rank nationally. And so I wanted to get like them headshots and professionally recorded because I love poetry, but I'm also a poet. And so when I saw this paper and I saw the way people reacted to it, as if AI poetry could possibly be better than human poetry, I had some really strong opinions on that, which I think brought me to this conversation today.
I mean, I want to lean in. I mean, men, you do poetry. Last I checked.
A little bit. I mean, and I've played. It's interesting because when you play with ChatGPT or LLMs, they're definitely good at rhyming, and even sometimes good at kind of making like you can just be like, hey, make a poem about the moon, and then also make it emotional, and it can kind of do that. But then it's funny because I was talking to a few friends a few days ago about how it's just some poets can't read their own poetry, and some it's just like some poets are just better at like doing the reading that makes you hit home. So obviously I don't know that can never be touched by even robots or AI, but
Yeah,
it kind of made me think a little bit
there's
about
different
this.
types of poetry. I would even say that like some of the poetry I write, some of it is meant to be read, right? It is meant to be put in like an audio format, especially slam poetry, right? Like you're really trying to drive something home. And so bringing all that expression to it is so necessary in order for the poem to be like really experienced. But, some poetry is just meant to be read on paper. That's just a totally different type of like medium and context and experience. And I would say that I write both kinds. Some are meant to be spoken, some are just meant to be read. Yeah. And so I could dive into that paper a little bit actually, because for a long time, apparently, it was observed in the literature that people could distinguish between AI generated poetry and human poetry, and that they didn't favor AI poetry as much, and they could tell the difference. And now it seems to have gotten to a point both where non-expert, poetry consumers are not able to tell the difference, and they tend to rate AI poetry as being more beautiful, having more imagery, being more lyrical, rhyming better, having more mood and emotion. So that's really, really interesting. But getting to like the point of poems and poetry as something to be experienced, there is something to distinguish there, I think. because it's not just really what you're reading or what you could hear, because right, AI could slam it, it cannot, there's AI generated voice and stuff like that. But for me, like what a poem quintessentially is just a form of human expression. It is quintessentially like this art of human expression. And so in that way, AI generated poetry can never be as good unless it is human, which seems kind of antithetical to what humans are and what AI is.
Well, that's our intuition talking, and I think that probably even feels right to anybody listening to this. I just sort of quickly synopsized the article on ChatGPT. We'll link to it in our piece. But the main meat of this article said that that there's an experiment involving 1,634 participants who were presented with a mix of human authored and AI generated poems. And the findings revealed that participants identified AI generated poems as human authored more often than actual human written poems, with an accuracy rate of 46%, which is below chance level. And additionally, AI generated poems received higher ratings in qualities such as rhythm and beauty. So I guess like what this article points to is it's really messing with our intuition when we throw it back out to the alleged objectivity of a polling effort. One thing that I thought was interesting in the way the article framed this experiment is that they were non-expert readers, meaning, I guess, like the average person, I guess would be another way of framing it, which to me is really interesting because there's some assumption that an expert poet person, like perhaps either of you, might react as you're perhaps even saying we should, that, there's something wrong about this or something smells wrong. But then it's like, well, then what is this cultural artifact in the first place? Like, who is it? Like you're saying, some things are meant to be read, some things are meant to be said out loud. It does. I think the reason this topic is so interesting is because this is this thing that up until recently, nobody thought was touchable. Nobody thought this was in play, and now it is.
Yeah, I think they identified non-expert as like 90% of the participants had only read like a few poems a year or something like that. But I think it goes beyond like, like the experience of it as in like, oh, it's read or, it's listened to or something like that. Because, I like Bukowski because I like thinking of him as a person. And when he is writing a poem where he's looking out a window and seeing, the little birdies, which is like a term he often uses to describe like young, attractive women, and he sees them in like their short skirts and stuff like that. I enjoy picturing him as this like gruff old dog, still writing lusty poetry. And so it's just for me like the enjoyment of it. It's not just the experience of like how you consume it, but it's how you experience it. And knowing there's another human on the other end of that, I think contributes so much to the experience because it's just you. It's like having a conversation with a person. And instead of like me texting Bukowski, he's like created this artifact of his own expression, telling the story of like an experience or some ideas of his. And then he is just making that available for everyone to like lean into and also experience. It's like some of the most original social media in a way. But much like the metrics in the paper, it can be lyrical, it can be beautiful, it can create some atmosphere, it has all these different dimensions to it, as opposed to like the compressed nature of a tweet, where like the artistic form of a tweet that is like considered valuable is like when it's like bangers, as the kids would say, it's like punchy and in your face and like short to read and timely. It's like poem is just like another format. And even if AI is really, really good at imitating it and can conjure up in someone's mind like a mood or, this imagery or something like that, unless there is a full blown human being at the other end of that artifact, I feel as though there's always going to be something that is quintessentially missing. Because what it really means to me, at least, is communication with another.
Now, I don't know. Are you a Trekkie?
No. I've seen like a couple episodes and I see the value, but I just try not to watch too much TV.
Fair. Well, there's a character in the Next Generation Star Trek called Data, and he has like a cybernetic brain. He's the only he's the only android of his type in this world, and the scientist who created him, I think, is dead, and But in any case, he is alive to a certain extent. There's a whole episode about this called The Measure of Man. And, like the Starfleet Academy identifies him as an object, and Picard makes the case that he is, has sentience. And he's like challenges in court, like, how do you prove that this one doesn't have sentience? And if we cannot, it's a whole argument. But I guess what I'm leading to is that what if we did get to a point where, hey, I have identified a consciousness that is having an experience in an embodied consciousness, which is robotic instead of body, and that embodied robotic body and brain writes poetry. Like, would that be enough would you have the experience of Bukowski? I mean, Data's journey in Star Trek The Next Generation in general is a very human experience that he's having, where he's like, I wish I was human, but I'm not. I don't have emotions. And then they install an emotion chip, and then he goes wild, and all this kind of stuff. And so you kind of watch as his journey evolves. And so, like, is that where we might be like, hey, I read robot poetry. I could relate to it like I relate to Bukowski, because I know that this being is going through a journey.
Okay, it's actually really fair to delineate, right? Like what it means to be human. What is human? Is it consciousness? Like what is it, right?
Yeah.
So I personally would not discriminate against, a being like Data, because and I'm slightly familiar with this episode actually, which is really useful for this conversation. Although I can't remember the specific arguments. I remember at one point one of the characters was like on the precipice of proving like he is indeed an object, and like pulled back a little bit. But anyway, I think like when I think about what it means to be human in a poetic way, let's just say, right? Like not getting into like the neuroscience of like cognition and consciousness and all of that, but in the most poetic way I could possibly put, to be human is to be limited, and to be human is to have bias, right? Like the human experience is bias. It is a limited aperture through which we are sensing and feeling and experiencing. And so if there is a being that has limited experience, right, it doesn't have access to all the knowledge in the world. Maybe it was initially trained on like all the possible knowledge that we could throw into a neural net at one time, but from that moment of like incubating that capability of consciousness, it then goes and lives a life, so to speak, and it has its own limited aperture of experiences and generates its own original or not thoughts, right? Like people can argue that our thoughts aren't original either. I wouldn't discriminate against that poetry. I think that would be really fascinating and exciting, and really deeply interesting. But that doesn't beg the question, would everyone else feel that way? Because even in this paper, I think they discussed that when the poetry was revealed to be created by AI, people rated it less favorably across a number of different dimensions. So that may be, if we ever get there, like a form of discrimination that these beings would have to face, is like the discount of their own experience. But maybe they can write some really powerful poetry about that can help us get to comprehension of what it is they're experiencing.
I mean, that makes me think about Neo. And like
okay,
that
say more.
the moment in the Matrix where he's like, down, I know kung fu, there's like where he's just downloading all this stuff, and like, yes, his aperture is still Neo, right? But his aperture starts to expand because now he can just access all this information. And what is the limitation of that? But I guess ultimately we're never going to get to a point where I personally as a human being could download everything. But the widening of my aperture via technology is that going to change how we feel about that? Like if I just had a robot grow up like a baby, and it's an SLM or whatever, a small language model inside of a baby's body or the robotic body, and I just let it grow naturally for 20 years. Like, what is my experience of that? I don't know. Anyway, this might be a kind of a weird tangent, but
I don't know. To go back to something you guys are both saying. I mean, I don't know. I come from having spent a lot of time in reality TV, and I've seen a lot less lower forms of art than poetry appeal to lots of people, and frankly, inspire, educate, give people distractions from their daily lives. There's a whole universe of content and its purpose that up until recently was only human creative. And I think there's a lot of stress in the industry where we're starting to notice that some of those things might be easily automated. And I think there's one thing that I often feel like is just sitting under our noses. I think music has been on this journey for a long time. I think it's been a long time since most people who call themselves music lovers connect to a earlier generation of music lovers that assumed that music involved hearing somebody perform it or a human being interact with an apparatus that made a sound that reached their ears in real life. We've all wildly exited those assumptions. We not only pre-record it and listen to it on repeat on demand, we also even listen to forms of it that are entirely computer generated with no instruments involved. And I just spent the weekend in Las Vegas and I saw a whole bunch of people going in and out of dance parties that were really into what they were doing. And I don't think any of them were even really paying attention to what record Tiesto was dropping. I guess I'm just saying, like, there's something about what some people would call slop. And I'm not suddenly associating Tiesto with slop. Some Tiesto fans can get really mad at me. But I'm just saying, like, there is this category of consumption that people are perfectly happy with. I think slop's become a big AI term. That there's almost even a sense of ownership. People are like, I like my slop. I enjoy it. That there's this little sub movement of people that are into it. So I guess I'm just sort of agreeing with, I think that on some principle, the thing that makes, an Ezra Pound, a product valuable is because I'm being connected to the human experience. Or like when I look at a Van Gogh painting in a museum, I see the brushstrokes and that affects me emotionally because that like some human did that thing with oil and somehow it's been preserved this whole time. All of the above, yes. But most humans don't ever spend a lot of time in that space. They're either too busy or maybe they didn't get educated, and they're fine and they're into it.
Totally.
So I'm just saying there's something about this non-expert that I sort of really keyed into in that article that I'm saying I think everybody's right. I'm not even trying to argue with anybody here. I'm saying I'm noticing it, that it's interesting that there's something that feels wrong, but it's still right. like right in that it happens and everybody's okay with it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's perfectly fine that people enjoy whatever it is that they enjoy. And AI spits out a poem and it touches someone and it moves them and it makes them feel like they're not alone in this feeling because they can relate to that feeling, then that is wonderful. But I do think that like there's tiers of enjoyment, right? There's like the people who want to consume and enjoy it for what it is, and then there's the nerds, like the art, I guess the equivalent would be the art snobs, right? Who are going to be like, I want to know who this person is and what the history is and like what they're alluding to, and I want the poetry to be obscure, and I want to have like I have to have an education in order to understand what it is that they're alluding to. I have to understand the time period. So there's just going to be different levels of enjoyment of pieces. And that's not to say one is better or worse, right? I don't mean to say like art snob as a derogatory way or saying it's like dignifying in any way.
But I think that point of art snob, I would pull any attempt at derogatory. It's just a premium. It means that there's this notion that that thing is still extra special in some way. Like I think we're all, Min and I spend a lot of time in the cinematic AI conversation, and there's a whole universe of debate and conversation about what this means about the art of cinema and stuff. But I'm pretty sure Christopher Nolan is fine. I think he will still make big movies that a lot of people show up to. And maybe that's its own conversation of who's grandfathered into that type of success. I don't know. That's a separate conversation. But I guess I'm pointing to people still go see live music, to go back to my metaphor. There's still a value to go to a small jazz club or a gigantic arena and watch Taylor Swift perform. So I just think it's interesting that we're going through a journey that I think other art forms have gone on, other mediums have gone on, that it feels extra weird when the things we didn't think were available to that automation moment. And that there's something very human going on in our consumption of that moment too.
Yeah, I completely agree. It would be, I think it would be delightful if people became more familiar with the medium of poetry through AI, if they became greater appreciators for the art, so that maybe they would actually go to poetry slams and poetry readings and try writing their own and things like that. Because it's definitely a vibe, when I spun up the Sunburnt Poets, I was trying to elevate the vibe of the local poets. Like I found them in the diviest dive bar, and then I would throw events to put them in really elegant settings, because I find I find poetry to be a really exquisite art because it's so constrained, it's so confined. You're not writing a book. Maybe it's the length of a song, right? But you have all this, unless it's a cappella, you can have all of this other information packaged up in a song. And poetry is like really distilled, which I find to be like really elegant often. So yeah, I hope maybe that medium kind of finds a more like visceral in-person audience at some point.
I think it will. I'm personally very bullish on things like theater in this kind of an environment, because I think I hear a lot about young people who are increasingly native to this technological life that some of us have lived on a bridge through. That I think to them, it's really novel to go to a national park and like go, whoa, it's really quiet here and my cell phone doesn't work, or what, I think there's something interesting about how people for whom technology is normal, not novel. And I think the authentic experience that I think is also native to the poetry conversation. But yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm just curious what Min's thinking about.
So I've been listening to a lot of Aretha Franklin lately.
Yeah.
Specifically, okay. I Say a Little Prayer, and I was just that me listening to that song over and over again is intersecting with this conversation, because I'm like, and just like, there's a very, back to your finite point, there's a finite amount of music from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and they are a particular vibe, they are a particular moment in time, like they're connected to my history with my parents emotionally, and like and their generation, all that. Would I listen to an Aretha Franklin song that was just recently discovered that they didn't know that she made, and they're like, oh my god, we found a secret recording? I would probably be like, oh my god, that's awesome. But it probably wouldn't hit as much as I Say a Little Prayer. And then the next thing over is we have just generated like 20 albums that are perfectly sounding like Aretha, and they sound great and I would dance to them, but they don't connect to me like, the dozen songs that I connect to because of my history of listening to those songs. It's a weird, but like it's not as far off of a standard deviation as maybe I would feel if you're like, oh, this is an undiscovered song, like this is a Tupac album that we didn't know he did, or John Lennon's, the Beatles, like there have been these moments in the last few years where they release a song that's been AIified or whatever. It's a weird, I don't know, I don't know if I have an answer to that, but it is making me feel a weird way about how
the context makes a difference, right?
Yeah,
it could be a subtle but meaningful difference. You could be presented a song that's actually AI generated, and it's sold to you as like this undiscovered, previously unreleased song, and you may be so excited because you love the artist, and then as soon as you are told that you've been deceived and it's actually AI generated, you may marvel at how well it did at deceiving you, and maybe like the beat or rhythm or whatever you actually do enjoy, and you're like, oh, I could see them writing those lyrics. There is that something suddenly missing, right? There's like just a little vacuum, a little gap, a little heartbreak that happens. At least I would presume. Maybe not for everyone, but for me, I would feel that way. I would be like, oh, but it's not them, it's not that being. And I mean, when we think about like old music too and context, it's like something that I really love to marvel at. Going back to like, to be human is to be limited and constrained. Is that like when we think about music through the 20th century, it's like they only had access to so much technology. Like the recording could only be so good. There was only so many like possible musical instruments. Now we have all these electronic instruments. And so it's like with what they had, like this is them like just kind of like as constrained as humans are in their time and talent and attention and like resources, like this is that expression that came forth. And it's so incredible to see the diversity of that, to see the quality of that. And I think as AI gets better and better, we may appreciate those limitations. Going to see a poet read original work, which is easier to fake than like playing a song, right? It's like if you're playing guitar, like people may be able to spot like they're not actually playing this. It may be easier to get away with reading a poem that wasn't written by you, but like appreciating the constraints, to appreciate the human that made it, I think adds a little something. That should be like a metric maybe that we measure for, is that distinguishing native luster of what it means to be human.
Where did you get
It's like
that
organic.
that line? Sorry, I was just curious. Where did you get the "to be human is to be limited"? Is that a your creation, or is that something? I'm just curious where that came from.
I'm sure other people have said it, but it comes from my work. Because, my organization, we map arguments, claims, and evidence from different points of view. So we, talk a lot about the sincere inquiry into truth, which means we talk about the limits of observable knowledge, and we talk a lot about human bias, either in our educational products or just like giving people the framing as to how to understand our work. Because even if you're trying to organize the collective knowledge of an entire civilization to try to figure out what to do about even like a technical or a scientific policy discussion, there are just simply limits to what we have observed as humans, to the experiments that we've done, to the data that we've gathered, to the opinions that we have raised. To be human is to be limited. And I often also say to be human is bias, because we get asked all the time, like, how do you overcome bias in your work? And it's like, well, we have a bunch of methods and stuff, but like, there's no such thing as unbiased. To be human is bias. And no matter what, unless you are an omniscient intelligence perceiving literally everything through all time, that's like bias. It's just a limited aperture. So yeah, kind of comes from my work a little bit.
Love that.
So here's where I am fascinated, because from the cinema lens, and I think when we met, we talked a ton about that, and I wonder, like, what where does one thing begin and where does one thing end? And I think that's a big conversation, I guess, in a lot of AI creation. Like, what is AI? What is originality in a world of AI? What is, like, if I come up with an idea, and I turned it into a AI short film, but in the process, I chatted with ChatGPT, and it gave me a bunch of feedback, and then I kind of edited in a certain way, but maybe it did give me an idea that I actually did use, and then I used it in the AI short film. Most of the film is generated with AI, right? And so every visual you see is AI. But then, I did make the choices to, ultimately say yes to whatever shots ended up in the edit. Then there's like one of our friends is a pianist, Aisha Denise, and I can never pronounce her name right, but
Aisha. I think it's Aisha.
Aisha, and she's like, she's been experimenting with, hey, she composes a piano piece, she plays it, and then she has generated the music, and then she like transcribed it and transposed it, and then she plays it too, and then she asks the audience which one is real. That's kind of a weird kind of thing that she's kind of doing there, which is really interesting and provocative. And then there's like, maybe jumping into poetry, it's like, if I write a poem fully, with my pen and paper, from my heart, from my soul, my mind, that is like this very organic. Then there's a scenario where I could have generated the poem entirely, but I liked it so much I performed it. And then there's the scenario where I wrote a poem and then I had the AI, edit it, or vice versa. I edited it down, but I did make that choice. It's kind of a weird. We're living in this kind of in between space where I don't know how, we don't quite have a framework to understand what that means, and like, let's say like Chapel Rowan, who is awesome, like, she generated a song entirely and then performed it at the Grammys, right? And to your point, if she did that and she didn't tell you, everybody would be like, oh my God, great song, probably.
Yeah.
And then, but the next day she's on Conan or David Letterman or whatever, and she's like, guess what? That was AI generated. There's that stank. People would feel that stank, be like, ooh,
The betrayal.
Yeah, the betrayal. Like, how dare you do that to me? Yeah, but it's
I think
so
Ashley
weird.
Simpson had that moment on Saturday Night Live. She was on SNL and she was lip syncing, and it wasn't.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
Lip syncing.
So there is a taxonomy, right? Like we
Right.
know this distinction between lip syncing and like actual singing, right?
Right.
And like singing from memory versus maybe like reading something. There's all of these different ways in which performances can like come about. And I think that framework is probably coming. I think it's probably coming from the field and the practitioners themselves. They will probably disambiguate and then popularize and memify terms, and then that'll get picked up in the literature and defined and maybe debated more formally with like a microscopic lens of like, well, what does that technically mean semantically, yada yada. Yeah, so I think that's coming. The tricky thing about film, though, uh, unlike music and unlike poetry, is that film necessitates the use of technology. Unlike poetry, right? Like poetry, you can just extemporaneously perform it and like it comes to your mind. You don't even need the technology of like a pen and a piece of paper, technically. And the same with music. People can just start singing and drumming on a rock or whatever. Like there are certain things that are kind of possible without other objects to assist in that. But film quintessentially requires technology. So I think that boundary is probably going to be a little bit more blurred. And depending on how persnickety people get, or become about it, maybe there are going to be like certain settings in which people can be creating their art where like their computer's recording everything that they do and then they out pops a metric 60% AI, there was like 40% of this human intervention, whether it's like cutting or reprompting or something. So who knows how snobby and persnickety it may become over time. But yeah, I guess it just and I think like the degree to which we delineate these things and we create a framework for it will be the degree to which culture feels as though it matters. Like we may very well go in a direction where most people do not care, it does not matter, because maybe we end up in this hyper individualized media consumption experience where it's like instead of us sharing music or sharing poetry or sharing what film, we're all just like the technology is so good that we're all just generating custom things specifically for us that we really like. And maybe it's very rare that someone even like considers watching a friend's film because the entire thing was hyper customized to like what that person who is consuming it prefers and can understand like allusions to and their background and like everything. So who knows where culture will take this? And then maybe only like really, really nerdy folks in music or film or painting or poetry or whatever will actually care about the classics anymore, or about like even understanding at like a certain scale, like what is going on in the field, right? Like people may be really interested to derive, well, what types of AI generated media artifacts are people making? What are their themes? And maybe even just like the data, and then they drill into very specific instances of things being created and that are available to look at. So who knows?
I think
Well,
the
to the point of,
personalization. Sorry, go ahead, man.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think like the personalization thing is a very kind of relevant kind of conversation because that's one of the big trends people look ahead and into what are things that are uniquely AI that might do to media. I think a little bit about. I teach an AI for documentaries class, and one of the things that I never heard my professors talk about, or even people in the space as much, is this. In spite of the word documentary and what it means to so many people, as a medium, it's quite blurry of where subjectivity and objectivity actually start and end. And I think it's only really been recently that there's an assumption that it's newsy to make a documentary. I actually think there's trends about like how the news industry has evolved and how a lot of people that used to work in that industry started finding themselves working at Vice and BuzzFeed and stuff. But I'm saying like a lot of the people like Werner Herzog or Brett Morgan or some of these like early days kind of like OGs of documentary, they don't even like to think of themselves as journalists. They like to think of themselves as filmmakers. I guess the point I'm making is that the idea of the subjective experience has always been this gray area, as much as we maybe don't like to think of it that way. And I think the way that sort of naturally lends itself to the way we create things, consume them, is interesting. And like, I think you call it persnickety or snobby. I do think there's just like a premium that things over time start to have as more options are available. Like there are certain things that end up in a museum as opposed to things that end up in the supermarket. And I think at some point underlying a lot of what you're saying is this question of value. What are society's values? What do they place value on, whether it's financial or cultural? And I think this article you flag, a lot of the things that we're sort of bouncing around, I think there's something new happening that's reflattening, realigning how do we value things. Because it used to be that things were valuable because of how hard it was to make them, or how unique it was to make them, or how human it might be. Something is at work that I'm not sure is complete yet in terms of what else it can do. So I don't know, that when I think back to your work and the policy work, there's something very profound about how even this observation of poems speaks to this, like we're sort of undergoing a major value shift that I think will still have the live freestyle poet live in a special place in our hearts because they can do something that even movies can't do, that there's no technology involved, like you're saying. But I do think there's a whole category in between the subjective and objective value that's emerging. I don't know. That's kind of what I'm hearing, and what I'm also fascinated that this is something coming from your work.
Well, let me just quickly say, when it comes to a cultural shift and us identifying our values, I'm going to go ahead and cast off the words persnickety and art snob. I'm going to adopt premium because I'm,
I like those words. My math teacher used persnickety, and I thought he was awesome.
I love
that's
persnickety.
my goals to use such denigrating language when I do mean premium, right? Because like I do exalt the humanness and like the effort and like the precious resource of life and time that is being put into human created works. So I'm going to adopt premium now and try to meet.
Well, Mr. Distad from my algebra class is upset the persnickety is going down in stock right now. So no, I think this is really profound stuff. I think we were really inspired by the way you think about this stuff. It's interesting for us to step away from our cinematic AI kind of universe. But I do think this is a broader trend. It's a broader trend. And I love your "to be human" sentence. I think we need to all spend more time finishing those sentences for ourselves in these days.
Well, I want to throw something in here that might be interesting, which is I was talking to my friend yesterday about design, and she's a designer. And I asked her, like, what, and she's fully embraced AI. She's in Midjourney, she's in all the things, V0, etc. And I was like, what do you think is going to survive in your profession? How do you differentiate yourself in your profession in an AI world? And she said two things: storytelling and taste. So like taste, which is maybe more obvious to people, I guess, which is, like you just can't really replace taste, I guess, even for an AI. Maybe, I don't know for now, but it's kind of like taste is something that you expose yourself to a lot of things, and you develop a taste around that that's specific to you. It's very personal, but it also is something that like your manager is not going to have when they try to hire a new designer. And then that's why she got into storytelling, because managers who hire designers might not have good taste, but you have to make the argument. You have to tell the story of why this taste matters, why the users are going to like that, which gets back into what we're kind of talking about with poetry and cinema. And it's kind of like, well, and that kind of made sense to me, because the storytellers do have to make this kind of like arc of the story, the arc of, the 3-act structure or 4-act structure, or how do you arrive in one part of the UI and you end up in another part of the UI? Why does that make sense? Why does that communicate on a heart level to the user? Like, I thought that was kind of interesting. I don't know if that's true in poetry and cinema, because last night I was watching this TV show called Paradise, and one of the characters has dementia, and he's like, I can only read poetry now because it all stays in my mind. I can't read the books that I used to read all the time because I lose a thought. But at least with poetry, I can sit here, I can read it, and I can feel it in the moment. I was like, damn, that's tough.
Profound.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think one can develop taste in poetry for sure, across so many different like vectors and dimensions. I do think, though, working in AI, that AI can discern taste. I think that AI, given an enormous corpus of poems or design of software or like what have you, could be prompted to discern what meets a certain taste. And I think that it can be trained to understand what that taste is and be able to identify it. Unfortunately, now that doesn't, that could just save us time, those with, refined taste. Like I have pretty strong taste when it comes to many things. Like, Min, I think you've been in my room. You've seen my room.
No,
No,
not yet,
no. Okay. I thought you were at my place and you saw my room. So when people like walk into my bedroom. This is not my bedroom that I'm in now. If people are watching the video, their jaws just drop because they've never seen anything like it. It's not quite any one style. It is definitely my style. It is like people have used words where it's like cottage core meets cyber witch, like just like there's over 102 plants in my room, and it's like this really lovely mix of like geometric gold and like really classical Greek things, and it's just a very unique, distinguished style, but clearly very developed and really well laid out. So I've like when it comes to interior design, I've developed that kind of taste. I think AI could spot that taste, and it could save me time finding things that I can contribute to the development of my taste, right? Instead of like what I normally do, which is just like haphazardly come across interior design objects that I want to add to my collection. I could actually intentionally shop, and it could scour the internet and be like, yes, this vase or this thing, this object would absolutely fit your style, and it is your taste. So I actually think it could be an advantage for AI to get that, because for those of us who want to expedite the enjoyment of an artifact or a room or whatever, we could have that much more quickly. And again, time is the precious thing, right? Time is the finite thing. It's probably one of the most like distinguishing features of what it means to be a limited human being. It's not just our limited apertures for perception, the limited amount of information we can engage in, but the limited experiences that we can have because we have limited time and like limited attention. And so AI actually speeding that up, I think, could really contribute to a much more rich enjoyment of life, including all of the arts.
I like that.
Although I will say, I will just add also from my background in like libraries and archives, is that there will always be people who love the journey instead. I used to work at the Internet Archive, and I helped them launch their new department digitizing government documents. Because in my work at the Society Library, and in mapping all these arguments about policy issues, we have the experience of knowing that government documents and government research tends to be the most substantive. Like the best stuff that we see, like on average, mostly comes from like government archives when it comes to issues related to the management of civilization, right? Policy issues. And so I joined the Internet Archive to help them launch a new department because I really want government documents, which are sitting in dusty boxes, in basements, in libraries, without enough resources to digitize them, to get them online and machine readable and extractable and all that stuff. But then when you talk to librarians and archivists who work in government, and yes, most of them that I've talked to, probably all of them I've talked to, understand the importance of things being machine readable, easily retrievable. Many of them have this romantic attachment to the pursuit of like, there is something obscure in a box somewhere that I'm going to have to go through an old system that has cataloged it and provided like handwritten metadata about what could be in there. And then I have to go to a place and dig through that box and like find these old treasures to see if it contains the knowledge that I want. And it's a very romantic idea of what research is. And so I think no matter how much AI could improve our lives by saving us that precious resource of time and getting us more expediently to enjoy the things that we want, there will always be people, no matter what, who are going to love the pursuit. And like, actually, that's how they want to spend their time. They want to spend their time, digging through chapbooks to find a poem that they like, or, just hitting up Friday night open music venues and seeing if they happen to come across a band that they like, or digging through a box to find information that's relevant to their research. That's how some people will love to spend their time. But many people want to conserve time because it's limited.
It's a case to be made for the archaeologist.
Yeah.
I
Case
love
be made
that.
for everything.
True.
No, I love how you bring it back to your work. I mean, I think what I'm getting away from our conversation is that a lot of things, and like, I think this almost like, I think we're in a moment where a lot's happening, and it's happening to us. And I think even just using your analogy of the way then somebody might choose to go on the journey of running through an archive, or somebody might choose to handwrite a poem, or choose to freestyle it, or they might choose to just auto-generate it, or they might choose to, I think the moment we allow ourselves to return to some kind of agency, the moment we then it settles in our like that's moving at a pace that now I'm standing on the train. I'm not like getting thrown by it. I think you start to decide what you want it to do for you, and it's either a train you want to get off of, or it's something that you like how fast it's moving. And I don't know. That's where I love how much the word human comes up in this conversation, because I think we're sort of bouncing around art and these practices, these very like governmental, it needs, but there's going to be this hybrid relationship, whether the robots or humans want it or not. We're going to have to work together for this all to, unless the matrix happens, we just become batteries.
Right.
Which, there's movies about that.
I think some things are absolutely inevitable, but I want to bring it back all the way to the very beginning, which, brought us to this conversation, which was like my reaction to people in this AI chat sharing this paper in the context of them assuming like AI could be as good as humans at creating poems. And there's something really important when it comes to art, which is that, or at least I'll speak for myself, I come to poetry both as a poet and a consumer of poetry. I enjoy reading poetry, human generated poetry, right? I enjoy knowing about the poet, but I am also a poet. And so I talked earlier about my experience consuming poetry and how that feels to connect to the human behind it. And knowing that there's a human on the other end changes the nature of how I experience the words on the page. But also as a creator of poetry, I just want to again underline that it is a form of human expression. And when it comes to poems, and I imagine this is true also for musicians and maybe even filmmakers too, it just kind of comes naturally. Like, sure, some people may need to practice in order to refine the talent, but it is almost instinctual. I imagine filmmakers, like they see a scene and they're like, oh, this, or like they can see it in their mind. It just comes into their mind, like they have a visual mind or something. Or they're obsessed with just like examining like what particular lens. I imagine musicians often hear the music in their own mind coming and they're like, oh, there's something there. Let me try and, pull out a pen and express it. As for poetry, it comes so naturally and sometimes just totally instantaneously. Complete poem just like comes through your mind like, Athena popping out of Zeus's forehead. And it kind of goes back to this idea. I think there was a TED talk about this at one point of like, the concept of genius used to be like a human was a vessel for like some muse. That's all it was. Like if they were talented at creating artworks, they weren't the genius as a human. They were like the vessel through which a genie could come through and express some artistic art form. So something that I think is really important for people who are not poets or are not musicians, are not painters, or not filmmakers to know and like appreciate and protect is that for some humans, this is an instinctual, natural expression and is worthy of being supported because it is quintessentially who we are. Painters got to paint, poets got to poeticalize everything. It's like, it's almost like as we march into this like AI age and this digital age and this technological age, let's like look, to our brothers and sisters and whoever's and realize that there is a fundamental part of them that needs to be expressed that should also be protected. So, hey, if you stumble across a new art form that you really enjoy, like film or poetry or whatever, maybe go and make sure you're supporting humans doing it too, because it's a part of them and it's a part of us collectively as humanity.
Amazing.
Support filmmakers.
support the humans. Well, honestly, thank you. I hope we get to do more check-ins with you and get more dispatches on how this all connects, because you have a very complete sort of observation of it, and I think it's really refreshing. It also feels very balanced between optimism and also kind of a very practical sort of observation of things that have a bit of a possibly neutral, maybe even negative reaction to other people. There's something, I love how you're balancing the process.
Thank you. Also comes instinctually because it's kind of what I do is map the different points of view, right? As a limited human, I can only like come up with so many angles at a time, but that's what technology is for, to map that all out in a database. So thank you. I appreciate it. I take that as a compliment.
So any final words, men?
Yeah.
No, thank you so much, Jamie. It's wonderful having you. I think it's poets got a po. I think that's the.
Oh boy. Okay.
Yes, that's gotta be like on a T-shirt or something. Poets got a po. See, like that's what we're talking about. Like, we can enjoy that, especially because Poe is a famous poet. So it just
There you go.
delicious. Love it.
Yeah.
Good job.
Well played, man.
Well played.
We will hopefully see you very soon on another sort of big brain explosion, which is what I think just happened to me.
Or we might see you in DC. Who knows?
Yeah, I'll be here for a little bit. Thank you both so much for having me. And I hope everyone enjoyed listening.
Awesome.
Thanks, y'all. Bye.